that I've been in contact with relative to how things have been going with the opening of school. So I hope everyone is well and healthy. So tonight I intend on giving you a brief status of the schools and then allow for some questions, because I imagine that all of you in your diverse roles have some questions relative to the opening of schools and maybe even the future of schools, because it is complex in the situation that we've been in. So as you heard a little while ago, I did transition here from to Ridgefield on April 1st. And if nothing else, it looks like I know how to pick the right time to transition. So I left Darien as the assistant superintendent and transitioned right to Ridgefield in the middle of a global pandemic in my first role as a superintendent. And so I've worked hard over the past 7 or 8 months, I guess it's probably a little bit more than that, to support the community, the faculty and the staff. And quite frankly, I could not have done it without the amazing faculty and staff and community in Ridgefield. I feel very, very fortunate to have transitioned here. I was an assistant superintendent not too far away in Darien, and prior to that, a principal in Westport. So I've been in Fairfield County. Looks like I spent about 5 years in each place for the past 10 years, and before that in Waterbury as an elementary principal. And so, as I said before, it has been an interesting transition, which I will talk about in a minute. But again, I have to start off by saying I've been so impressed with the Ridgefield community. The generosity of spirit in this community is clearly evident. Especially in the most difficult times, right? These are the times in which you really get to understand what the depth of a community is. And it's been a pleasure to see this community and how it's rallied and come together to make a difference in the lives of kids and families in what no one could have planned for. Even the best planning couldn't have planned for this. So I'll start off on April to June. So April to June was an interesting time, as I mentioned earlier, is that we had just transitioned here in Ridgefield in the schools to a global environment, to a digital environment where kindergarten through 12th graders were hopping on to a electronic device, and that's where they were experiencing their education for the first time. And it wasn't really, for any school community, it wasn't something that anyone would have expected. And while kids and faculty for sure have experienced learning digitally, not for a traditional school day. And so there was a lot of learning that had to happen for our faculty, for our students, and for our families, that they too were now experiencing a little bit of homeschooling, right? And so for some of them, they were navigating their jobs and also their children. And depending upon the age level of their children, that was certainly not an easy task. And so there was a lot of growth, I would say, for all of us, myself included, in understanding what this environment was like and how to make it the best experience that it could be for kids. And I would say that the biggest challenge that we faced then, and I would also say that we face now, is that what we know about kids, and actually what we know about learning, is that it's a social experience, is that we learn best with others and through others. And unfortunately, when we transitioned to this environment, there was a lot that we all had to get used to. First of all, I have to invite you into my home, right? I'm inviting you into my home. You might be seeing my kids. You might be seeing or hearing my pet. So that was one shift that our faculty had to make, and so did our kids. And making that an environment, because remember, classroom teachers spend a lot of time creating an environment that's engaging for kids, right? So we know that happens those first couple weeks or last weeks of summer. Teachers are spending countless hours, right? Making sure the bulletin boards are just right and the notebooks are just right and everything looks perfect, because our learning environment is part of the anchors to our learning. It's the residual impact of something that a teacher has taught, and all of a sudden that's shifted. And instead of seeing anchor charts or visuals, you're looking at my window seat and my window and perhaps my neighbor's home. Similarly for children, we're walking into their bedrooms or their kitchens or wherever there's a quiet space. And depending upon what that quiet, what that space is, you don't necessarily, there could be 3 kids in the room and they're sharing a space, or a kiddo's finding the quietest corner in their home. And so that in and of itself was really complex. And then of course there was a natural shift in the learning that had to happen, that all of a sudden now I'm learning the digital tools. My children are learning the digital tools. And somehow we're trying to find a way to create that or emulate that classroom environment. And I would say that that was an incredible challenge and for everyone. And that was soup to nuts, and everyone did the best that they could in that environment. And we took a lot away from that experience. And we knew that while there were some great strengths, that if we were to be in this environment in the fall, that we would have to make some shifts to make it better for everyone. And so naturally our minds were kind of going in that direction, and we were starting to plan for that, but we were also waiting for some direction from the state Department of Ed. But actually what's kind of interesting about that time also is not only did we transition into this kind of experience, but remember what was happening around us. We were in full lockdown, right? People were being told to stay home. So there wasn't even the social interaction that would happen outside of a traditional school day, right? Kids weren't able to engage with their peers. They weren't able to go on holiday. There weren't vacations. They were being asked not to go to the grocery store, not to go to the playground. So it was pretty intense on the social emotional side as well. So outside of the school experience, there was this other added layer. And for those of you who have children at home or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, you probably remember what that felt like for them. And there was a lot of sadness that came from feeling very isolated. And so that was a piece that we were also trying to navigate in this kind of environment, right? I can't tell how someone's really feeling. I can't feel how someone's feeling. It's hard for any one of you to interact with me to let me know that today is not a great day for whatever that reason is. And then of course, there's the level of stress that people might be experiencing at home, right? Because now all of a sudden we're together and we haven't had to spend, no one's really spent that much time together, right? And in a traditional environment, we're all going to work, going to school, engaging in activities. So that was really an interesting time, a really, really difficult time for all of us in different ways. And certainly then there was a level of stress on jobs and, what's happening with people's employment and whether or not they'd be furloughed or lose their jobs or whatever the case may be. So a lot of stressors happened during that time. And then all of a sudden we felt a little bit of a light, and that light, I would say, happened somewhere around the end of June, where people were starting to transition back into, a more, I don't want to say normal, but a more typical experience, right? You were seeing kids come out in the playground wearing masks, of course. People were able to transition into their work environments, even if it was just for a number of days, even if you had the social distancing piece. And then, of course, there was the state Department of Education, the Department of Public Health, the CDC. Everybody's trying to figure out, how are we going to open schools in the fall? What is it going to look like? And so we were establishing in Ridgefield, like many communities, establishing committees of people that had different perspectives. And so we were pretty fortunate in Ridgefield, where we developed a reopening committee, and we had basically lanes, if you would, maybe that's the best way to describe it, as a lane. So we had, a group of folks that were looking at teaching and learning, a group of folks that were looking at transportation, a group of folks that were looking at communication. And we had all these different subcommittees with lots of talented people that had backgrounds that were incredibly diverse, but perhaps targeted. We had a group of medical folks coming back for the health and safety. And with all of their input, we created a reopening plan that aligned itself to the State Department of Education. And we put in some things that were required, that we knew that were required of us. And then we questioned some things with the state because it felt like there were some inconsistencies in terms of what we were being asked to do. And as a result, we opened school with 3 different models, really, a low risk model, a moderate risk, and a high risk. And based off of each of those models, and based off of what we were hearing was happening in the community, we would then transition our schools. Our elementary came back in as a hybrid to transition. So that meant 2 different cohorts of kids, same at the middle and same at the high. We were able to bring our elementary kids back full time. Unfortunately, not able to do the same for our middle and high, primarily because we were not able to socially distance appropriately based on the number of kids and the space in our schools. And so that actually, I would say, despite some bumps in the road that you would expect, worked out pretty well. We had parents and kids that were able to make a decision to say, I don't feel comfortable coming to school, so instead I'm going to stay home and I'm going to stream into my learning environment. So that was an option for families and kids. And then our other children, K-12 or pre-K-12 actually were able to come in based on the model at each of their levels. So it allowed for some flexibility. If for some reason a child felt that, or a parent felt that, they changed their decision because of some things that might be happening, or perhaps some things that were changing at home, they were able to go back into the model that felt safest for them. And so I think we started off the school year in a pretty good place. We had some pretty good procedures ready to go. And all really went well. We were one of the first schools to open in the state, which I think was probably now, right? I didn't necessarily know that then. And so as a result, I was pretty scared. But now I could say that was probably a good decision because we were able to open earlier, and knowing what we know now, I think that was the best way to get kids in for the most amount of time. So here we are now, and now we are obviously seeing the uptick in cases in our community and certainly in our schools. And as a result, we've had to make some shifts, across the board. Sometimes that means that we're closing a school. Sometimes that means we're just cohorting and quarantining a number of faculty and students. And sometimes it means that we have to make some really unique decisions to keep a school open with faculty and substitutes and things like that. And that's happening day to day, right? Every day. In fact, today, early this morning, we had some challenges with respect to our high school and had to have our students remote in so that it gave us an opportunity to make sure our school was safe before opening it back up, and identified everyone that needed to quarantine. And sometimes those things take time. As we look ahead, we will one day not have COVID, and one day I will be a typical superintendent working on what matters most, which is teaching and learning and supporting a world-class education for kids in Ridgefield. Certainly for the children that are here, and certainly for those that are looking to transition into a community such as Ridgefield and with families. And typically, right, if you're coming in, either planning for a family or have one, the school system, the public school system, is one of the most important key pieces that you look for in terms of values. And so as we look towards the future and think about creativity, innovation, continuing to work on the good things that are here, but always stretching to see what else we can do, and what other innovations should our kids experience now that we've learned what we've learned over the past 7 or 8 months. I think that the future is prime for this community, certainly for the faculty and staff that has worked incredibly hard, and the community that embraces its schools. So it has really been an interesting time. And, with every situation, I would say that there are always silver linings in partnerships that that come as a result. And this situation is no different, obviously, in a far more significant way, in terms of the health and safety, and certainly the tragedy that we've seen across our nation and in our community. But we are looking for the good in anything, and we're trying to find it here, and we will work our way out of COVID and transition back into school the way that school should feel for our students. And I'm glad to be a part of that. I met with a group of high schoolers today who really shared a lot of insight on the experience that they've had. And we're so lucky. I mean, I had freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, and they were so incredibly bright and articulate, and really were able to give me a lot of feedback on what the experience has been like, and perhaps how we can even make this situation a little bit better. So I look forward to being able to do that. So that's it. That's me in a nutshell, and hopefully in our school system right now in a nutshell, but hopefully you have some questions that I hope to be able to answer.
So anyone have questions, remember, demute yourselves if you're going to ask.
Susie, this is Bob Schwartz. Thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation, and welcome to our community. I know that one of the concerns that some parents are raising, even kids, is that it's not the same learning at home as it is being in the classroom. And how will we assess whether or not a student has actually received the level of education that they need to go on to the next grade, or, you know, from middle school to high school? How do we assess that going forward? Because I don't think even last spring, some of the state testing was done.
Yeah, Bob, that's a great question. And it's interesting because we had our tri-board meeting last night, and in the spring, you know, as I was advocating for the budget, actually it wasn't quite my budget, but the budget that was here, one of my greatest concerns was that the social emotional learning, always thinking, right, in my mind, I thought, okay, we're coming back to school in September, right? So let's plan a budget for September in a typical environment. And so at that time, my greatest concern was the social emotional learning of students. How are they emotionally? How are they going to come back to school? What would access look like on an emotional level, on a mental health level, and making sure that we have the supports for kids then regarding that. And then of course there was the academic piece, of which we did not have spring data, nor would that data have really been valid, because the way in which kids access, we know for sure, the way in which kids access this type of learning experience is very different than the experience that they have in school. And so even if we had that data, what would that data really tell us? So we were really looking forward to the fall data, student data, to let us know how we were going to support kids. When it comes down to you know, a grade level transition or retention, that was really never in our mind, because first of all, I think the research is pretty clear on retention, but moreover, we knew that our students would have academic gaps, and then that would just require our supports to really target that gap, whatever that gap might be, and try to reduce the gap as quickly as possible and make as many gains as possible through differentiation and other techniques. That said, come into this school year, and there are a lot of variables, Bob. There is, even when they're in, so the kids, for sure, the experience is different. There's no doubt. But even the small things, right? The mask wearing, which we know is clearly so important, right? But it changes things. It changes the way you can actually hear someone. It changes the way that you can see someone's, when you're learning phonics, for example, or phonemic awareness in a young child's life, being able to hear the sounds and words when I can't even see your lips. And then when, you know, your teacher's taking their mask up and down for that purpose, it's different. And so we already know just some small, subtle things like the mask, which is incredibly important, has changed the way that kids engage socially. You know, they're less comfortable speaking because oftentimes they have to repeat themselves. It isn't as comfortable. Not to mention, again, the other part of the experience, which is half of my kids, or some of my kids, are in the high school, probably half, right? half of my peers are on a computer screen and half of them are in class. And so how I engage with this group versus that group. And so the instruction is not the same. The pacing is not the same. You know, the teachers at the elementary level are taking children for their mask breaks, right? You know how little people walk, slowly or really fast. It's either slow or really fast. And everything they do is going to take time. And so just that, you know, taking kids out for a mask break is not 5 minutes, it's 20 minutes. Having kids wash their hands requires more time. We're washing our hands more often. So small things like that, albeit subtle, they seem like, oh, well, you're just taking mask breaks or you're doing more hand washing. Not if you're a kindergarten teacher. You know, that's a lot of time you're losing just getting in line and making sure you're socially distanced and all of that. So there for sure is a loss of instruction. There is for sure an issue with curriculum compacting that will have to be navigated for all kids. And for some kids in this environment, regardless of the grade level, the access isn't the same. So even if I'm a secondary student, 11th grader, 12th grader, my executive functioning skills might be different than yours, Bob. You know, I might be someone that I can attend in school because I feel like there's a different level of accountability and I'm engaged in a different way than when I'm at home, when I see my phone buzzing or I'm distracted by the dog or I hear the noise. So we know that this experience has impacted student learning. There's no doubt. And that's not only in Ridgefield, that's of course in every community. So I think the short answer to your question, if I was to summarize all the things that I just said, is even this school year, despite everyone's best efforts, there's been inconsistency, right? Kids come in, they come out, there's been hybrid, there's been not, is going to require that when we come back to a typical experience, that we're going to have to do some heavy lifting on the part of our teachers are going to have to do heavy lifting on the part of our kids because it's just not the same. And so assessing is another piece to this, Bob, is that we are assessing for the most part when kids are in school, but we've had to have assessments when kids are home as well. It just hasn't been, ideally we do it in school, but we have a group of students that are not in school, right? That are temporary remote learning because that's an option for them. We also have students that may be in quarantine for a number of weeks and therefore they have to take their assessment. And so how valid those assessments are is another layer, right? We know that a lot of different things can happen. Number one is, I didn't know follow the directions. Oops, I may have missed that. Or accessibility to other resources are available to kids. And so they might be accessing those other resources and therefore, you know, they may appear to know more than they actually do, right? And so for us, all of that are things that are happening or might be happening, but we really want to know what kids understand, know, and are able to do so that we can support them in the best way that we know how. But these are unprecedented times. No one could have anticipated this. And so our kids are doing their best, their families are doing their best, our educators are doing their best. And we will continue to hone in wherever we can to try to reduce that gap. And so small groups and things like that are happening even in the digital world. Again, not ideal, right?
I think we have a few more questions. Alex, you had a question?
Yeah, Susie, welcome to Ridgefield. I've got a question about curriculum. I mean, basically, I'd like to know what the attitude is to this 1619 project that was announced by the New York Times and it was published, and there's been a lot of noise about it. And whether any of that is going to be incorporated into the curriculum or whether it's going to be left up to the individual teachers. You know, basically, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't know enough, Alex, about the 1619 project, but I can answer the second part of your question without the first part, is that curriculum is not left up to individual teachers. So my background is curriculum and instruction. I was an assistant superintendent, K-12, in Darien. And so teachers always have their hand, or in my point of view, they should always have their hand in curriculum work because they're the ones that bring it back to kids and make it stick. But that said, curriculum decisions should be common, and those decisions are not made in isolation. They're not made by one individual educator. The teachers bring the art to the curriculum, and we offer the box, right? And then they have the autonomy within that box. So I don't know enough about what this project is, so I would have to know more about that, but I do know about how we write curriculum.
Well, it's basically saying that, the history of the United States is founded on, on racism and so forth, that it started in Jamestown and progressed from there, that kind of thing. So it's pushing the race and, the systematic racism, that's their theme.
Yes.
Which, yes, we have racism in this country, but I don't think it's to that extent, and I don't think it's the driving force in in our country.
Yeah.
So, I've read that some school across the country have incorporated that into their curriculums, sort of almost replacing, the standard history of how the United States has progressed, grown, founded, and the philosophy. So I'm just curious, how that might be brought in. You obviously can't just ignore it, but
Right.
it shouldn't be the driving force.
Yeah. With topics related to anti-racism, diversity, equity, advocacy, we have certainly been talking about those type of topics. In terms of holistic changes or revisions in our social studies curriculum, at this point, we're not there, Alex. We just revised, I believe Ridgefield has just revised their social studies curriculum based on the new frameworks that were offered by the State Department of Ed a couple of years ago, back, I think somewhere around 2015, 16. And so I don't know that we're prepared to make any other revisions at this time. But those types of decisions do come through the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction, along with our content experts, which are our teachers. Those decisions then should come to the Board of Education for curriculum approval.
But do you incorporate parents involved in that decision? Do you ask opinions? Do you take any kind of feedback?
Not typically from parents, because we typically work off of standards, and then the content or the primary resources that we might offer typically are aligned to those standards, Alex. So if your work is based off of standards, then it becomes clearer on how you're writing your curriculum. When in terms of resources or a historical perspective, that's another piece to it, is multiple perspectives on, or it's less about the content, but more about the strategies that we put into place to help kids understand and communicate around the various perspectives that people may have around a particular content, a particular moment in time or a particular era. So no, with respect to parents, that's not typical in a curriculum writing process. It's typically, again, standards based, and you work off of that.
Sure. Thank you.
I have a question. Susie, has any consideration been given, no matter how good a job is done in Richfield or in Connecticut, has any consideration been given how we can catch up and what we've lost? I guess I'm thinking about finances too, extended summer school, because let's face it, the kids are going to lose out, especially at the elementary level. So, I'm concerned about losing out over the long run.
Yeah. So am I, Joe. I am a believer that that kids can learn, and sometimes quality over quantity matters most. And so you can compact, you can differentiate. What you need to be able to do, Joe, is assess your kids really well and then target their instruction. And so how do we do that, especially at the elementary level? Through small group instruction, through very targeted. So not everyone's going to need to know those 6 letters, because some kids can learn unintentionally, right? Without direct teaching. Other kids need that very direct teaching. So how are we differentiating? How are we pulling small groups? How are we trying to, it's like a child with a learning difference, let's just say, right? At the start of the school year, Joe and I may be both 3rd graders, but I have a learning difference. And so understanding that gap that I have, I may need to make to become a 4th grader. I may need to make more than a year's growth. I may need to make a year and 3 months growth, where you come in as a 3rd grader and you leave as a 4th grader. I may have come in as a 3rd grader, but really I was still short 2 or 3 months from the prior year. And so for me, my teacher is going to have to make more than a year's growth in a year's time. Whereas for you, a year's growth. And for some kids, they come in as a 3rd grader, but are maybe at a 3rd grader 5th month. And so for them, they're going to make that year's growth, but they're going to still end up as a 4th grader 5th month, because their needs are different. And so I think at this point, yeah, we may have a lot of kids that are going to need additional support in the summer, whether that's students with learning differences or students who just couldn't make the gap up in an appropriate time. For others, we may just be pulling out pieces of the curriculum that are not as essential, right? And so there may be some things you can't do that with, right? There's some content areas, in mathematics, that there's a very strategic way in which you have to teach things. But sometimes you can look at that science unit that was weather and say, I'm going to push it, I'm going to do some more math. I'm going to pull out that weather unit and I'll try to target some of those skills, maybe with another unit in 1st grade if I'm in kindergarten. So there's a little bit of compacting that you can do to try to make up some of that time. And so it's a lot of curriculum work on the part of our educators to figure that out.
Susie, I have a question. I'm Joel Third from Keeler
Hi, Joel.
Tavern. We're providing a lot of virtual content for the school system. We have usually, when we permitted, have a number of students there in person, like over 1,000 or something. We run through the various historic venues that we have to offer. I just wonder, how effective is the virtual material that we have provided recently? How's that working into the system that you might know about?
Joel, I don't know. So I can certainly check in with our Director of Humanities. I would say this, though, is the diversity in resources that Keeler Tavern and others have provided has been a great benefit to our students and to our teachers, because remember, they don't have a ton of resources virtually, right? We didn't have that toolkit. So I do know that our teachers have been incredibly grateful for the resources that they're provided by others, because we don't have that curated enough, right? Of that curated supports for our faculty. So I don't know specific to the ones that you've offered. I'll be glad to check in on that for you. But I do know that our teachers and our directors have been incredibly grateful for the resources that have been shared with us.
Good. Well, thank you, Susie.
Rich?
And this is Rich Fazana, by the way. We talked on the phone.
Hi, Rich.
Well, this is probably going to be the hardest question. New York just canceled all their classes and closed everything because of COVID. What do you think it will take us here in Ridgefield to get to that point?
Yeah, that is a hard question. And let me explain why that's a hard question. Because of all the other questions that came before your hard question, Rich, is that there is kids learn best when they're in school.
That's right.
Okay. And so I'm not a medical professional. So that doctor that's in front of my name, let's be very clear. As I say to the kindergartners, I don't give shots. I can give a sticker, right? I'm good at that. I'm not a medical professional. And so I'm guided by those that know better than me when it comes to that piece. What I can share with you is that kids learn best when they're in school. In particular, our youngest kids, but all of our kids. All of our kids. That's why we have schools, right? Because that's where they learn. That's the environment in which they can access the most learning. We're better than we were in the spring at a digital learning environment. There's no doubt. But asking a kindergartner, a 1st grader, even a 4th or 5th grader to learn on a screen for 6 3/4 hours days is not reasonable. And then to reduce that time, which naturally we would have to do, right, means that we're losing a lot of momentum with kids. And so what we are doing, Rich, is we're watching carefully, and we're being incredibly conservative when it comes to the process of quarantine, contact tracing and quarantining. So for us, for example, in a classroom, we don't look to see who is 6 feet apart or more than 6 feet apart. We quarantine the classroom of kids. And so yes, there's an impact on kids with that, but we feel that we've taken a conservative approach. And therefore, when we're looking at keeping our schools open, we feel more confident in the decision-making that we're engaged in. And so if we at any time believe that there is spread within our schools or transmission within our schools, it would be likely that we would have to close schools at least for a short time and perhaps more. If we felt that we could not staff our schools, which we've been in that position. In fact, we were in that position today, where our high school needed to transition into a remote learning experience because we did not have the ability to staff the school, lack of substitutes. Then we would obviously have to close school. And that's the position that we've been in. On the flip side, we had some good news today. So we had one of our schools where we did quarantine a number of students and a number of faculty because we did lean in on the conservative side. And we learned that that individual who we believed was a probable positive, actually tested negative and tested positive for the influenza. I'm not glad that the person has the flu, but what that meant was that we could bring back that group of faculty and children back to school. So the question about what is it going to take to close schools, I'm not sure that it's going to be one particular thing, but we're going to work hard to keep them open as long as possible, as long as it's safe to do so. And I have no doubt with the uptick of cases, people are beginning to worry because, of course, you know, it is and was very scary. And so we're doing what we can to ensure that the mitigating measures are in place in our schools, which our kids are doing, our faculty are doing. They're wearing their mask, they're keeping their distance, they're washing their hands. But at some point that may not be enough.
You know, probably the context in which all this is happening is going to be the key determinant. How's the town doing? And if it just keeps on getting worse, there's probably a number there, or at least a series of days of numbers and so forth, where it seems that you got to close down and close down a lot of things, not just the schools. But that's the trick of determining where that actually is.
Yeah, the impact of closing schools is beyond the academics. Yeah. There is the social emotional well-being of kids. And we saw that with athletics, right? The parents rallied, kids rallied around athletics because it's not all about, I mean, obviously I'm going to prioritize academics over athletics, of course. But at the same time, the emotional well-being of kids, getting up every day, getting dressed, going to school, seeing my teacher makes a difference.
It does. Susie, I had another question having to do with mental well-being, but of staff, of the faculty and so forth, and the whole issue of burnout. And do you get a sense that there's any accelerated burnout going on here among the teachers themselves?
So Joe, we sent out a questionnaire to our faculty today. And I think that's real. I think if you were to ask me, probably just about an hour I hopped on this call, I was starting to feel burnt out. There's a lot of variables that are impacting that. There is the teaching, you know, the ability to teach a group of kids here and a group of kids here. It's the amount of learning that our faculty has had to do. It's the risk taking that they've had to be engaged in, right? Taking risk. it's the fact that there's a parent probably watching them, right? They're auditing their teaching every day. There's a lot of risk that comes with that. There's some fear. That fear is real, is they're seeing their colleagues have to quarantine. Some of them have had to quarantine several times in a row, just by very nature of where their students happen to be, right? So there's that. There's people who may have family at home, that it's not just concerned about me going to school or work, but then I come home to an individual who may be compromised. And let's just also remember that the vast majority of us, if not everyone, has not taken a holiday, right? We couldn't go anywhere, right? There wasn't a vacation. There wasn't your typical summer holiday or spring holiday. That's not been there. And so that reprieve, that respite just hasn't happened for a lot of people. And so, yeah, I think that there's no doubt. And I think I wouldn't be fully transparent if I said that there is definitely burnt. And then there's the flip side, the teachers that are feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't anymore. And then there's the faculty and staff that, you know, need to come to school. That's part of their routine and their structure. And so as much fear as they may have and as much anxiety as they may have, this takes their mind off of what's happening outside in the world.
I would have to believe that the in-person teaching availability of gratification of seeing kids respond to whatever it is that you're doing, probably not there very much at all in the virtual setting.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that teachers prefer to teach with kids in school, but having to navigate both of them, it's not been easy for anyone. And our teachers are really, they're heroes. They're coming to work every day. They're putting a smile on their face. They are advocating on the part of kids, being really creative, taking risks, opening up their homes, teaching in environments that no one could have predicted this in March. No one. Most of us thought, and the kids thought, they were closing down for a couple of weeks, and it was like a 2-week snow day, right? And then all of a sudden it wasn't. And we don't hear kids saying, I don't want to go to school anymore. That's not part of vernacular.
Susie, I'd like to share a positive about this situation. So I have a daughter who's now a senior at the high school, who has been fully virtual, fully remote, for the reason you just described of having somebody who has compromised issues at home and how to navigate that. And she is a person that you have described, she would qualify as having learning differences.
Mm-hmm.
And what has been remarkable, and she would love to be in school, there are aspects about it, but what I have found as her parent is the mishigash that is part of high school, the shenanigans, the poking, the maybe potential bullying or mean girl stuff, the stuff that you can't control when she's in a physical setting, is gone. It's completely gone. Why? Because the only people she connects with, and she has a network of friends that she connects with on Zoom and talks to and chats with and texts with, but they're her friends. There's no external influences that can kind of seep in. And she's a sensitive person, and that has been really good, that somehow we figured out how to weed out. So as much as there are some negatives, I just thought it'd be nice to bring forward, there is actually a positive, a small silver lining there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I spoke to the kids today, our high schoolers, of course, everybody's experience is different, but the kids shared, like, our teachers are really good at this. And, I'm learning okay in this environment. For the kids that are in the same circumstance as your daughter, Pamela, is that they're saying, you know what, and that's why sometimes the transition to the cohort C, when they need to, because they have the sniffles or they're not feeling as well as they should, isn't that big of a deal, because they have felt like some kids can access their learning very well in this environment. So I'm glad to hear that.
Up better than she was when she was in school again, I think, because there's less distraction, honestly, for her.
Okay, well, that's good news. That's definitely good news.
We have time maybe for one more question.
Susie?
Anyone?
Can I ask a question, Susie? This is Kip
Yep.
Shibley.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Very fascinating. I was just wondering if you know, maybe as a last question, if in all your experience and given this unbelievable time, are there any things that you're seeing that might cause you to think about how you would do things going forward? Any takeaways that might strike you as something that we would carry forward, and how things may change for the system as a whole?
Yeah, and so what's interesting about education is many of us, and I'll say that I'm a little bit this way, is that I'm pretty concrete, right? I kind of look at that end result, and then I know the steps that I need to take to the end result. I think what we've learned in this circumstance, Kip, is that you can't always plan. You don't always know what that end result is, right? And so how do we create learners that are so flexible? How do we create environments for teachers that are so flexible that you can be resilient and make shifts and changes without knowing the end? Because I think that's what happened here, is that yes, technology was certainly a variable. There's no doubt that we could have been better prepared when it came to digital learning skills, from beginning when our kindergartners all the way up. There's no doubt. Same with our faculty. And because there was a lot of learning, understanding Google Classroom, understanding Meet, Zoom, all those things. But that you could see, right? I could see that, okay, if I need to be prepared for the possibility of having to learn digitally, and you can concretely know how to get there. But I think if anything is that we have to learn how to deal with the unknowns, and how do you even plan or prepare for that? How do you create students, learners that are resilient, flexible, that can shift, that can learn quickly and adapt quickly? And what are some of those soft skills, if you may, that support kids in that kind of environment? Because we did see a lot of breakdown early on, because it's just not the way that we've prepared. We've prepared somewhat concretely. And then there's the probably the ones that are easier to anticipate, right? Is that how do we create a digital learning environment should we experience this kind of environment? But what happens when you don't even have a digital tool? Let's just say, then what? How do you plan for that? How do you plan for what you can't plan for? It's complicated, I think, because we could have expected some of this, but I don't think we could have ever expected all of this. And, how do we support everyone in being flexible, adaptable, and being creators? And that's what I would say. If anything, it's some of those other dispositions that that aren't concrete, that aren't right in front of you. That's, probably the silver lining that I would have. And just shifting back to the other concrete pieces. And I think something that maybe I'm taking away from Pamela's point is that, and actually even from our kids earlier today, one of the things that the kids recommended to me said to me was that our teachers traditionally, in fact, I think you all spoke about breakout rooms a little while ago. Our
Right.
teachers traditionally, want kids to collaborate. And so they actually created big breakout rooms through Google Meet. And this one student said, in this environment, collaboration and discussion isn't working that well, because kids don't know each other, because they've never met each other in real life. So when you set up these breakout rooms, it's kind of awkward. And so another takeaway, just even from what Pamela was saying, is how do you create or support the social emotional piece of collaboration, discussion, perspective taking in this kind of environment, because it's different. because you don't have a connection. It's, you know, that's something that we have to work at, really. And so that's another piece I would say, is that in an environment where you can't see, you can't touch, you can't gather the emotions, how do you create structures so that you can? And you can build discourse and perspective. But it was kind of interesting because this kiddo was like, you know what, I think I'd rather just have the teachers direct teach, because I'm not getting enough from my peers, because we haven't created those relationships yet.
Well,
You know,
Susan, this has been
let me
an
just say,
outstanding opportunity. Joe, we're going to have to end it here, but this was outstanding. And I am sure that we could keep on going and going and going, and because there's a lot of concern and question and so forth. And this has been an eye opener, but also it's been very reassuring, I'm sure, for all of us to hear what you had to say and know that you know, the school system is clearly in good hands, and greatly appreciate your having the time to spend with us tonight. Now, we talked about